The big metal ship floated above the dark forest like a giant bird watching something scary below. Quan pressed his blue, scaly face against the cold glass window and looked down at the trees that had been killing people for 300 years. The forest looked like a black ocean with twisted branches reaching up like dead fingers trying to grab anything that came too close. The other alien council members stood around him making worried sounds with their different mouths and throats. Day clicked his orange claws on the metal floor while his 4 eyes kept moving back and forth watching the human girl walking toward the forest edge. She looked so small from up here, like a tiny dot moving toward certain death everyone knew about. The Whispering Death Forest. It was famous across the whole galaxy for being the place where nothing lived and nothing escaped. Warriors with the biggest guns had gone in and never come back. Scientists with the smartest machines had tried to study it and disappeared forever. Even the robot soldiers built from the strongest metals had been found later as melted pieces, scattered around the forest entrance. But now this human female named Nari was walking right toward it like she was going to visit a friend. She had no big weapons strapped to her back, no shiny armor covering her soft skin, no force field generators humming around her body. Just a simple backpack that looked old and worn and some clothes that seemed too thin for such a dangerous place. The betting had started 3 days ago when word spread that a human was going to try entering the Death Forest. Aliens from every corner of the galaxy had sent their money and made their guesses about how long she would survive. The most hopeful one said maybe 10 minutes if she was very lucky and ran fast. The realistic one said 5 minutes at most. The mean one said she would be dead before her feet touched the shadow of the first tree. Quan had put his money on 5 minutes too, even though something felt wrong about it. When he looked at the human girl through the viewing screen, she did not look scared. She did not look worried. She did not even look like she understood how dangerous this was. She just walked with steady steps like someone going to work on a normal day. The forest made sounds that could drive people crazy. Whispers that spoke in languages no one recognized, but everyone understood. They told stories about pain and death and hopelessness. The sounds got louder as you went deeper, and most people started screaming or running or just curling up in balls before they got very far into the trees. But Nari stopped at the forest edge and pulled out a small metal box that made quiet beeping sounds. She wrote something in a notebook with a pencil that looked like it came from a children's school. Then she put the box away like it had told her exactly what she wanted to know. The whispers from the forest got louder, as if the trees were trying to scare her or warn her, or maybe both. The sounds made all the aliens on the ship feel sick and worried, but Nari did not seem to hear them at all. She just closed her notebook, put it in her backpack, and started walking into the darkness. Between the trees, Juan wrapped his long tentacles around his chair arms and made a gurgling sound of fear. He had studied the Death Forest longer than anyone else on the council. He knew every terrible thing that lived inside those twisted branches. The singing vines that wrapped around people and squeezed until their bones broke. The mind-breaking whispers that made people forget who they were. The shadow creatures that ate fear itself until there was nothing left but empty bodies. But the human girl just walked past the first grove of shadow trees like they were normal plants in a normal garden. She even stopped to look at some of the twisted bark and touch it gently with her fingers like she was petting a friendly animal. This made several council members make throwing up sounds because everyone knew those trees were poisoned to touch. The forest had 3 main killing zones that everyone knew about. First was the grove of shadow trees where the bark could burn through any material and the roots moved to trip people into falling. The second was the crystal clearing where reality itself broke down and people saw things that were not there until they went completely insane. The third was the heart of the forest, where no one had ever gone and come back to tell what was there. Most people died in the first zone. The few who made it to the second zone always died there. No one even knew if the third zone really existed because no one had ever seen it and lived. But Nari walked through the shadow grove like she was taking a walk in a safe park. She did not run when the roots moved under her feet. She did not scream when the whispers got loud enough to make the watching aliens cover their ears. She just kept walking and looking around and writing in her notebook like she was a student doing homework. Young Jay leaned forward in his chair and whispered to the others, "Maybe the forest is not really evil. Maybe it just does not understand how to talk to people without hurting them." The older council members looked at him like he had said something stupid, but they did not argue because they were all thinking the same. Impossible fought down in the forest. Nari reached a small open space between the trees and did something that made all the aliens watching her think they were seeing things that could not be real. She unpacked a tiny metal stove from her backpack, filled a small pot with water from a stream that everyone knew was deadly poison, and started making tea. The stream water that could dissolve metal and bone bubbled happily in her little pot like regular water. She added some leaves from a small bag and stirred it with a wooden spoon. Then she sat down on a fallen log that should have been covered with flesh-eating moss and drank her tea while writing more notes in her book. The whispers from the forest got quieter, like the trees were confused about what to do with someone who was not afraid of them. The shadows that usually moved around to scare people seemed to be pulling back from where Nari sat. The very air around her looked cleaner and brighter than it had been for hundreds of years. Quan realized. He was holding his breath and forced himself to breathe. Normally, this was not how things were supposed to happen. The death forest killed everything that entered it. That was what made it famous. That was why people feared it across the whole galaxy. But this small human female was sitting in its most dangerous parts, drinking tea like she was in her own kitchen. After she finished her tea, Nari packed up her little stove and continued walking deeper into the forest. The monitoring equipment on the ship started making strange noises as if it could not understand what it was seeing. The energy readings that always showed chaos and death were changing to something none of them had ever seen before. It looked almost like the forest was becoming calm. 3 hours passed, and the Alien Council members were starting to panic in ways they had never panicked before. Their monitoring screens showed numbers and readings that made no sense at all. The Death Forest was not acting like the Death Forest anymore. The whispers that usually got louder and more terrible as people went deeper had stopped completely. The shadow creatures that ate fear were nowhere to be found. The singing vines that strangled everything were hanging limp and quiet like regular plants. Juan pressed all 6 of his tentacles against his head and made sounds of confusion. His orange skin was turning purple, which meant he was very upset and very confused. He had spent 40 years studying every terrible thing about this forest. He knew exactly how it killed people, and exactly how long it took. The human girl should have been dead 2 hours and 50 minutes ago. But instead she was walking around like she owned the place. The screens showed Nari had reached the crystal clearing where reality was supposed to break down and make people see things that were not real. This was the place where the bravest warriors started screaming about monsters that were not there, and the smartest scientists forgot their own names and wandered in circles until they died of thirst. But Nari was setting up a small camp, like she was planning to spend the night. She unpacked a tiny tent that looked like it came from a toy store. She rolled out a sleeping bag that was bright blue with yellow stars on it. She even hung up a small lantern that made warm yellow light instead of the cold white light that most space travelers used. Everything she did looked normal and safe and completely impossible. The forest around her was changing too. The twisted trees that had been bent into horrible shapes for hundreds of years were slowly straightening up. Their branches were uncurling from angry fists into normal tree branch shapes. The poisonous thorns that covered everything were shrinking back into the bark. The constant fog that made everything look gray and dead was lifting in patches, showing glimpses of green grass underneath. Day clicked his claws faster and faster on the metal floor, making a sound like rain on a roof. His 4 eyes were moving in different directions, trying to watch all the screens at once because he could not believe what any of them were showing. The energy readings that always showed chaos and anger were smoothing out into gentle waves. The temperature that was always too cold or too hot was becoming comfortable. The air that was always thick with poison was becoming clean enough to breathe. This is impossible, Day said to the other council members. His voice sounded like rocks falling down a mountain. This forest has been killing people for 300 years. It does not just stop being dangerous because one small human walks into it. There must be something wrong with our equipment. There must be something we are not seeing, but their equipment was working perfectly. Every sensor, every camera, every monitoring device was showing the same impossible thing. The Death Forest was becoming less deadly with every step the human took. It was like her presence was healing something that had been sick for a very long time down in the forest. Neri had finished setting up her camp and was now doing something that made all the watching aliens feel dizzy with confusion. She was collecting samples of the things that should have killed her, the poisonous water that dissolved metal she put in small glass bottles, the deadly soil that burned through boots she scooped into, plastic containers, the toxic plants that killed everything they touched. She carefully cut pieces from and wrapped in paper, but nothing hurt her. The water did not burn her skin, the soil did not eat through her containers. The plants did not poison her when she touched them. It was like the forest had decided she was safe and was protecting her from all the things that made it dangerous to everyone else. She had also brought out more of those small beeping devices and was placing them around her campsite. They made soft sounds like happy birds, and she wrote down numbers from them in her notebook. She seemed to understand what the devices were telling her, even though the aliens watching could not figure out what they were supposed to do. Young Jay was the first one to say what they were all thinking. Maybe the forest is not evil at all. Maybe it has been trying to ask for help all this time, but no one understood what it needed. Everyone always came here with weapons and armor and force, feels ready to fight something terrible, but what if fighting was never the right answer? The older council members made disagreeing sounds, but they could not argue with what they were seeing on their screens. The forest was clearly responding to Nari in a way it had never responded to anyone else. Instead of trying to kill her, it seemed to be welcoming her. Instead of making terrible sounds, it was becoming quiet and peaceful. Instead of being a place of death, it was starting to look like a place where things could grow and live. Rin, who was the oldest member of the council and had lived for over 200 years, suddenly sat up straight in her chair. Her ancient eyes got very wide as she understood something that made her whole body shake with excitement. "The forest is sick," she whispered in a voice like wind through dry leaves. "It has been sick this whole time, and we have been treating the symptoms instead of looking for the disease." This idea hit the other council members like a physical blow. For 300 years they had been sending their best warriors and their strongest weapons against something that was crying for help. They had approached the death forest like it was an enemy that needed to be defeated, when it was actually a patient that needed to be healed on. Their screens Neri had pulled out what looked like a small chemistry set with tiny bottles of colored liquids and measuring tools that seemed too simple to do anything important. But she was mixing different liquids together and testing them on small patches of diseased-looking ground. Where she applied her mixtures, the black poisoned earth started turning brown and healthy-looking. Small green shoots began growing from soil that had been dead for centuries. "She is healing it," Quan said in amazement. His blue scales were shimmering with colors that meant he was feeling wonder and disbelief at the same time. "The human is actually healing the death forest. She came here not to conquer it or destroy it, but to make it better." The forest itself seemed to understand what Nari was doing. The whispers that had been silent started up again, but now they sounded different. Instead of threats and warnings, they sounded like someone saying "thank you" over and over in a language made of wind and rustling leaves. The shadows that usually moved to scare people were gathering around Nari like pets wanting to be near their favorite person. As night fell in the forest, Nari lit her small lantern and settled down to sleep in her bright blue sleeping bag. She looked as comfortable and safe as someone sleeping in their own bed at home. The forest around her had become so peaceful that small animals were starting to come out of hiding. Places that had been empty of life for hundreds of years were showing signs that living things were returning. The alien council members realized they were going to have to completely change everything they thought they knew about the death forest and about the small human female who was teaching them that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is offer help instead of bringing weapons. Day 2 brought changes that made the alien council question everything they had ever learned about science and forests and the way the universe worked. The monitoring stations were showing readings at their best scientists said were impossible. But the screens did not lie. Nari was not just surviving in the death forest, she was making it better with every hour that passed. The human had woken up with the sunrise and eaten a simple breakfast of bread and fruit from her backpack. She drank water from the stream that had killed thousands of explorers and brushed her teeth with it like it was perfectly safe. Then she unpacked what looked like a children's chemistry set and started doing experiments that made the most advanced alien Scientists feel stupid. She had small bottles of clear liquid and colored powders that she mixed together in tiny amounts. She tested the soil and the water and the air with instruments that looked like toys compared to the massive machines the aliens used for the same jobs, but her simple tools were telling her things that the alien technology had never been able to figure out. Guan, who was in charge of all the council monitoring equipment, kept shaking his head until his neck hurt. The energy readings from the forest were completely different from anything they had recorded before. Instead of the chaotic spikes of anger and death, they were seeing smooth, gentle waves like a calm ocean. The temperature was becoming comfortable. The air was becoming breathable, and the poisonous radiation that had made the forest deadly was dropping to safe levels. She is treating it like a science experiment, Guan said to the others, while watching Nari carefully measure something with a ruler that looked like it came from a school classroom. She is not fighting the forest at all. She is studying it like it is a puzzle she wants to solve. The forest was responding to her methods in ways that amazed everyone watching. Plants that had been twisted into horrible shapes for centuries were slowly returning to normal. The thorns that covered everything were shrinking back. The fog that made it hard to see was clearing away, revealing that underneath all the poison and death there had always been a beautiful ecosystem trying to survive. Nari moved through the forest like a doctor visiting patients. She would stop at patches of diseased ground and test them with her simple tools. Then she would mix up solutions in her tiny bottles and apply them carefully to the sick soil. Within hours of her treatment, the black poisoned earth would start turning healthy brown and small plants would begin growing. The singing vines that had strangled so many explorers were still there, but they were not trying to hurt Nari. Instead, they seemed curious about her. They would reach out gently to touch her equipment or wrap loosely around her arms like friendly snakes. She would talk to them in a soft voice and they would move away politely when she needed to work. This is completely insane, Juan said while watching through his viewing screen. His tentacles were curled up tight, which meant he was confused and scared. The vines are supposed to kill anything that moves. The shadow creatures are supposed to eat fear. The whispers are supposed to drive people mad, but they are all acting like the human is their friend. The whispers had changed completely too. Instead of the terrifying voices that spoke of death and hopelessness, they now sounded like someone trying to communicate. They rose and fell in patterns that almost sounded like language, as if the forest was trying to tell Nari something important. She would stop and listen carefully, then write notes in her book. Like she was starting to understand. By midday, Nari had set up what looked like a field laboratory in a clearing that had been one of the most dangerous spots in the entire forest. She had her chemistry set arranged on a fallen log, her instruments laid out neatly on a cloth, and her notebook open to pages covered with drawings and numbers that meant something to her but looked like random marks to the watching aliens. She was working with the focused attention of someone who loved what they were doing. Every test she ran, every sample she collected, every note she wrote was done with care and precision. She treated the forest like it was a patient she genuinely wanted to help, not an enemy. She needed to defeat. The results of her work were becoming visible everywhere she had been. The path she had walked was now lined with healthy plants and clear streams. The air along her route was clean and fresh. The terrible feelings of dread and fear that had always filled the forest were being replaced by something that felt almost like hope. Rin, the oldest council member, was watching everything with growing excitement that made her hands shake. She had lived long enough to remember stories from before the forest became deadly, stories about a place that had once been beautiful and full of life. She had always thought those stories were just legends, but now she was seeing them come true. Look at what she is doing, Rin said to the others. Her voice was full of wonder. The human is not using force or advanced technology. She is using basic science and patience and kindness. She treats the forest like it has feelings and intelligence instead of like it is just a dangerous obstacle. The other council members were starting to understand something that made them feel ashamed and excited at the same time. For 300 years they had approached the Death Forest with the assumption that it needed to be conquered or destroyed. They had sent weapons and armor and shields and warriors, but they had never sent a single scientist who was willing to ask the simple question of what was actually wrong. We could have done this, Quan said quietly. His blue scales had turned a darker color that meant he was feeling sad and Guilty, we had better tools and more knowledge and greater resources, but we never thought to approach it the way she is approaching it. We assumed we knew what we were dealing with without ever really looking. The forest continued to heal around. Nari, as she worked her simple treatments, were spreading outward from each spot where she applied them. Like ripples in a pond, the healing was moving through the ecosystem, fixing problems that had existed for centuries. The twisted trees were straightening. The poisoned water was becoming clear, the dead soil was coming back to life. She had also started talking to the forest out loud, telling it what she was doing and why. The whispers would respond to her voice, becoming softer and more musical, as if they were learning to communicate in a way that did not frighten people. She would ask questions and wait for the sounds to change, then write down what she thought the forest was trying to tell. Early evening, the transformation was so dramatic that several council members wondered if they were watching the same place that had been called the Death Forest for 300 years. What they saw now looked like a garden that was waking up after a long sleep. Beautiful flowers were blooming. In places where nothing had grown for centuries, birds were starting to return to areas that had been silent for generations. Nari packed up her laboratory as the sun set and made herself a simple dinner over her tiny camp stove. She ate slowly while watching the stars appear overhead and listening to the gentle sounds of a forest that was finally at peace. The whispers had become a soft lullaby that seemed to be saying thank you in every language the universe had ever known. The alien council realized that they were witnessing something more important than just the healing of one forest. They were seeing a completely different way of solving problems, a way that started with curiosity instead of fear, with questions instead of assumptions, with healing instead of fighting. On the third day, Nari made a discovery that changed everything the Alien Council thought they knew about the Death Forest and about the universe itself. She had been following readings from her simple instruments deeper into the woods than anyone had ever gone before. The devices were beeping faster and making different sounds as she walked, like they were getting excited about something they were detecting. The aliens watched on their screens as she pushed through areas that should have killed her instantly, but instead seemed to welcome her presence. The trees moved their branches aside to make a path for her. The ground became solid and safe under her feet. The air cleared of poison so she could breathe easily. Even the shadows seemed to gather around her like friendly companions instead of threats. Deep in the heart of the forest, where no living being had ever walked and returned, Nari found something that made her stop and stare. Her simple radiation detector was making sounds like an angry bee, and the readings on its tiny screen were higher than anything she had seen before. She pulled out her notebook and wrote down numbers while walking in circles around an area that looked different from the rest of the forest. The trees here were more twisted than anywhere else. The ground was black and cracked like burned earth. The air shimmered with heat that came from below instead of from the sun above. Her instruments were all pointing toward one spot where the soil looked like it had been melted and reformed many times over hundreds of years. Nari set down her backpack and pulled out a small folding shovel that looked like it was made for digging in a garden. She started carefully removing the black soil, one scoop at a time, testing each layer with her instruments and writing down what she found. The deeper she dug, the more excited her detectors became, and the more notes she wrote in her book. 3 feet down, she hit something hard and metallic that was not supposed to be there. She brushed away the dirt with her hands, revealing a surface that was smooth and curved like part of a giant sphere. The metal was a color she had never seen before, and it was warm to the touch even though it had been buried for what looked like a very long time. This is it, she said out loud to the forest. Her voice was full of excitement, like someone who had just solved a puzzle they had been working on for years. This is what has been making you sick, all this. Tame. The Alien Council members were leaning forward in their chairs, trying to understand what their screens were showing them. Yul, who was an expert on ancient technology, suddenly made a gasping sound that meant he had recognized something important. "That is a reactor containment shell," he said in a voice full of amazement, "but the design is older than anything in our databases. It must have been buried here for centuries." Nari had reached the same conclusion using nothing but her basic tools and careful observation. She was now digging around the buried object, mapping its shape and size with her measuring tape. The buried thing was huge, much bigger than it had looked at first. It stretched out in all directions under the forest floor. like a metal mountain that had been covered by dirt and time. Her radiation detector was screaming now, making sounds that meant danger, but Nari did not seem worried. She just moved more carefully and took more measurements. She had figured out that the buried object was some kind of spacecraft that had crashed here long ago. The ship reactor had been slowly leaking exotic radiation into the soil for hundreds of years, poisoning everything that tried to grow and driving the forest ecosystem. Completely insane, the whispers that had terrified so many explorers were not evil spirits or supernatural threats. They were the forest-owned neural network crying out in constant pain, begging for someone to make the burning stop. The trees had twisted themselves into horrible shapes, trying to get away from the radiation. The water had become poisonous because it was carrying radioactive particles. The air had become toxic because radioactive gases were seeping up from the buried wreck. Everything that made the death forest deadly was just symptoms of radiation sickness in an ecosystem that had been slowly dying for centuries. This is incredible, Hua said while watching Nari work. She figured it out using instruments that look like children. Toys. We have sensors that can detect quantum fluctuations from light years away, but we never thought to scan for something as simple as a radiation leak. We were so busy assuming the forest was supernatural that we ignored basic scientific possibilities. The council members were feeling a mixture of amazement and shame as they realized how simple the solution had been all along. They had spent 300 years treating the death forest like it was cursed or possessed or inherently evil, when all it really needed was someone to find the source of its sickness and fix it. Nari was now unpacking more equipment from her backpack, but this was different from her simple chemistry set. These were tools that looked more advanced, small devices that hummed with energy and had displays that showed complex diagrams. She had been carrying radiation treatment equipment all along, hidden in her innocent-looking camping gear. She is not just a scientist, Quan realized with growing respect. She came here knowing exactly what she would find. She figured out what was wrong with the forest before she ever set foot in it. All that testing and measuring she has been doing was just confirming what she already suspected. The human began working on the buried reactor with the same careful patience she had shown with everything else. She used small tools to remove corroded panels and replace damaged parts. Her movements were precise and confident, like someone who had done this kind of work many times before. Every action she took was designed to stop the radiation leak without causing an explosion that would make everything worse. The forest responded to her work immediately as she sealed each leak and repaired each damaged system. The whispers became softer and more musical. The twisted trees began straightening even faster. The poisoned water started running clear. The dead soil showed new signs of life with tiny green shoots pushing up through the black earth. The aliens watched in stunned silence as centuries of damage began reversing itself in real time. The radiation readings on their instruments were dropping steadily towards safe levels. The air quality was improving so fast that their sensors had trouble keeping up. The temperature was stabilizing into the comfortable range that supported normal forest life within hours of Nari starting her repairs. The death forest was transforming into something completely different. The name that had struck fear into hearts across the galaxy was becoming meaningless as the place revealed its true nature as a beautiful ecosystem that had been suffering for far too long. She did it, Juan whispered in amazement. One small human with basic tools solved a problem that stumped our entire civilization for 3 centuries. She did not need our advanced technology or our powerful weapons or our sophisticated theories. She just needed to ask the right questions and be willing to get her hands dirty finding the answers. The forest was singing now, not with the terrifying whispers that had driven so many explorers mad, but with sounds of joy and relief and gratitude. The trees were swaying in a breeze that smelled of flowers instead of poison. The streams were babbling with clear water that reflected sunlight. For the first time in hundreds of years, Nari stood up and brushed the dirt off her hands, looking satisfied with her work. The buried reactor was now safely contained, its dangerous leaks sealed, and its radioactive emissions stopped. The forest could finally begin healing properly without new poison being pumped into its system every day. She had not conquered the death forest or destroyed it or claimed it as territory. She had simply been a friend who helped out when help was needed, and that had made all the difference in the universe. By the fourth day, the transformation was so complete that the Alien Council members could hardly believe they were looking at the same place that had been called the Death Forest for 300 years. What had once been a realm of twisted horror was now the most beautiful garden any of them had ever seen. Ancient trees stretched toward the sky with leaves that sparkled like jewels in the sunlight. Clear streams wound through meadows filled with flowers that bloomed in colors that had no names, but the forest was not finished, showing its appreciation for what Nari had done as she packed her simple equipment and prepared to leave. The very ecosystem seemed to come alive with gratitude. Every step she took was marked by new flowers that bloomed instantly in her footprints, creating a carpet of colors that spelled out thank you messages in dozens of different alien languages. The trees themselves were bending their branches to offer her gifts, fruits that glowed with inner light and tasted like the sweetest dreams, nuts that contained concentrated nutrition that could sustain a person for weeks, seeds that would grow into plants capable of surviving in any environment. Even the vacuum of space, the forest was sharing treasures it had been protecting for centuries. Small creatures that had been hiding in the deepest parts of the woods were now emerging to see their savior. Animals that had been twisted into horrible shapes by the radiation were revealing their true forms as beautiful and gentle beings. They brought her flowers in their mouths, crystals in their paws, and songs that sounded like laughter mixed with music. One who specialized in studying plant behavior was making excited chirping sounds as he watched. The screens, the trees are communicating with each other, he explained to the other council members. They are sharing information about what the human did for them, and they want to give her something valuable in return. This is intelligence on a level we have never seen before. The forest was indeed thinking and planning its gifts carefully. The largest tree at the center of the woods had been growing for over 1,000 years and had memory stored in its living wood. It offered Nari a piece of crystallized sap that contained the experiences and knowledge of 10 centuries. Everything that had happened in this part of the galaxy was recorded in that amber-like crystalline group of flowering vines. Presented her with seeds that had been evolving in isolation for hundreds of years. These were plants that could grow anywhere, adapt to any climate, and produce food and medicine and materials that could help civilizations across the stars. The vines had been keeping these seeds safe, waiting for someone worthy to receive. The most amazing of all was the gift from the forest neural network itself. The whispers that had once been cries of pain had become something like a living map. The sounds formed patterns that showed safe routes through dangerous parts of space, hidden passages that bypassed the territories of hostile aliens, secret planets where resources could be found, pathways through regions that had never been successfully explored. Nari accepted each gift with quiet thanks, treating the forest like the intelligent friend it had revealed itself to be. She spoke to the trees as if they were old companions, promising to visit again someday and to tell others about the real story of what had happened. Here, she left behind some of her equipment as a gesture of trust and friendship. The radiation detector that had helped her find the buried reactor she placed at the base of the great central tree so the forest could monitor its own health. The small chemistry set she left in a clearing so any future visitors could test the water and soil and see that everything was safe now. Even her notebook with all her observations and measurements she gifted to the forest so it would have a record of its own healing. As she walked toward the forest edge, the entire ecosystem followed her with gentle attention. Flowers turned to face her like tiny suns following the light. Birds sang farewell songs from every branch. Streams bubbled more cheerfully. As she passed, the very air seemed to shimmer with contentment and peace. The Alien Council members found themselves standing up and applauding as they watched her emerge from the woods, looking exactly the same as when she had entered, except for the satisfied smile on her face and the collection of impossible gifts in her backpack. She had not conquered anything or claimed any territory. She had simply helped a friend in need, and that friend was grateful. Behind her, the forest settled into peaceful contentment for the first time in living memory. The Death Forest was truly dead, replaced by something that would need a new name. Something that spoke of hope and healing and second chances. The whispers that had once terrified explorers were now welcoming songs that invited visitors to come and see what could grow when old wounds were finally allowed to heal. Doll was already composing messages to send across the galaxy telling the story of what had really happened here. The news would spread quickly that the infamous Death Forest had been healed not by superior weapons or advanced technology, but by simple scientific curiosity and the willingness to help instead of harm. Other civilizations would want to learn from this example. They would ask for human consultants to look at their own impossible problems with fresh eyes. Maybe the ruins that drove explorers insane were not cursed, but just broadcasting harmful frequencies. Maybe the planets where technology failed had natural electromagnetic fields that could be understood and worked with. Maybe the space anomalies that defied physics were just following rules that no one had figured out yet. The forest had taught them all an important lesson that day. The most powerful force in the universe was not superior technology or overwhelming strength. It was the simple human tendency to look at the impossible and ask, what if we tried a different approach sometimes? The smartest solution was also the most obvious one if you were brave enough to see past your own assumptions. Nari walked away from the forest with her head held high and her backpack full of gifts that represented the gratitude of an entire ecosystem. She had proven that mysteries were just invitations to learn, that dangers were often just problems looking for solutions, and that sometimes the best way to defeat an enemy was to discover it had never been an enemy at all. The Alien Council would remember this day for the rest of their lives as the moment they learned that humans did not see the universe the same way everyone else did. Where others saw threats, humans saw puzzles. Where others prepared for war, humans packed scientific instruments. Where others assumed the worst, humans dared to hope for the best. And sometimes that hope was exactly what the universe needed to heal. The news of what happened in the Death Forest spread across the galaxy faster than light itself. Within days, every civilized world had heard the impossible story of how a single human with basic camping equipment had solved a mystery that had puzzled the greatest minds for 3 centuries. The story was told and retold until it became legend, but the facts never changed. One small human had succeeded where entire armies had failed. The aftermath sent shockwaves through every government, research center, and military academy. In known Space Council meetings were called on hundreds of worlds as leaders tried to understand what this meant for everything they thought they knew about solving problems. The old ways of approaching challenges with weapons and force suddenly seemed primitive and wasteful. Quan found himself giving the same speech to packed auditoriums across the galaxy, explaining what the council had witnessed. We need to completely rethink our approach to impossible problems, he would tell audiences of scientists, warriors, and politicians. How many conflicts could we resolve with understanding instead of violence? How many mysteries could we solve by asking why instead of assuming supernatural causes? The demand for human consultants became overwhelming. Within weeks of Nari's success, every species that had encountered unexplained phenomena started sending requests for human scientists to visit their worlds. The request came with detailed descriptions of problems that had stumped their best minds for generations, ancient ruins that drove explorers insane, planets where all technology failed without explanation, space anomalies that seemed to break the laws of physics, energy fields that killed everything. They touched creatures that appeared and disappeared without following any known rules. The list of impossible mysteries was longer than anyone had realized. Human researchers began traveling to these worlds with the same simple approach that Nari had used. They packed basic scientific instruments instead of weapons. They asked questions instead of making assumptions. They treated mysteries as puzzles to be solved instead of enemies to be defeated, and one by one the impossible problems started revealing perfectly logical explanations. The ruins were not cursed, they were broadcasting powerful electromagnetic frequencies that interfered with brain function. The planets where technology failed had unique mineral compositions that created natural electromagnetic pulse effects. The space anomalies followed perfectly predictable patterns once you understood the gravitational forces involved. The deadly energy fields were radiation leaks from ancient technology that could be safely contained. Every solution was simpler than anyone had expected, but finding those solutions required a different way of thinking about problems. It required the willingness to set aside assumptions and look at evidence with fresh eyes. It required treating the unknown as an invitation to learn rather than a threat to be destroyed. Became famous for his reports on human problem-solving methods which he presented to scientific conferences across the galaxy. Humans do not see mysteries the same way we do, he would explain to audiences who hung on every word. They do not automatically assume that unknown means dangerous or that ancient means supernatural. They approach every puzzle with the same basic question: what if there is a perfectly normal explanation that we just have not thought of yet? The former Death Forest became a pilgrimage site, but not for warriors seeking glory. Instead, it attracted researchers and scientists from every corner of the galaxy who came to study both the remarkable ecosystem recovery and the methods Nari had used to achieve it. The forest welcomed them all, sharing its knowledge freely with anyone who approached it with genuine curiosity and respect. Universities began offering courses in human style problem-solving which focused on observation, patience, and the willingness to question basic assumptions. Students learned to pack scientific instruments instead of weapons when investigating the unknown. They practiced asking what instead of assuming why. They studied the art of treating symptoms while looking for root causes. Nari herself continued traveling from world to world, solving problems that others had given up on as impossible. She visited planets where gravity worked backwards and discovered underground magnetic fields. She investigated cities where people disappeared and found transportation systems that had been running automatically for thousands of years. She explored regions of space where ships lost power and located natural phenomena that drained energy in predictable patterns. Each success followed the same basic pattern: careful observation, methodical testing, and the fundamental belief that everything in the universe followed rules that could be understood. She treated every mystery like a patient that needed diagnosis rather than an enemy that needed conquest. Her toolkit remained simple, but her results were consistently remarkable. The galaxy learned that the most dangerous assumption was the assumption that something could not be understood. Just because previous attempts had failed did not mean the problem was impossible. It might just mean that no one had asked the right questions yet, or tried the right approach, or been willing to spend enough time listening to what the evidence was trying to say. Young scientists across hundreds of worlds began carrying simple instruments and basic chemistry sets instead of advanced scanners and powerful computers. They learned that sometimes the most sophisticated equipment was not as useful as a curious mind and the patience to observe carefully. They discovered that asking for help was often more effective than trying to solve everything through force. The transformation was not just technological, but philosophical. Entire civilizations began approaching their ancient mysteries and modern problems with new attitudes. Instead of assuming the worst, they dared to hope for logical explanations. Instead of preparing for battle, they packed research equipment. Instead of sending warriors, they sent scientists. Strayed relationships improved as species that had been enemies for generations discovered their conflicts were based on misunderstandings that could be resolved through communication resource. Disputes ended when human consultants found new sources that everyone had overlooked. Cultural tensions eased as ancient grievances were revealed to be simple translation errors or differences in customs that could be easily accommodated. The galaxy became a more peaceful place, not because of superior weapons or stronger defenses, but because more problems were being solved instead of fought. The human approach of treating mysteries as invitations rather than threats had created a chain reaction of understanding that spread from world to world like ripples in a cosmic pond. In the end, the story of the Death Forest became more than just an adventure tale about one brave human. It became a lesson about the power of curiosity over fear, the importance of questions over assumptions, and the simple truth that sometimes the best way to defeat a problem is to discover it was never really a problem at all. The forest itself grew into something more beautiful than anyone had imagined possible. Its trees reached toward the stars with branches that sang in harmonies that could be heard across light years. Its flowers bloomed in patterns that told stories of healing and hope. Its streams flowed with water so pure that a single drop could heal wounds that had festered for lifetimes. And somewhere in the galaxy there was always another impossible mystery waiting for someone brave enough to walk up to it with a notebook and a curious mind and ask the simple question that could change everything. What if we tried being helpful instead of harmful? What if we tried understanding instead of fighting? What if we tried hope instead of fear? The answer was always the same. Sometimes that was exactly what the universe needed.